QuitSmokingWeed.com, the podcast on Spotify.
Around week 2, something shifts that nobody warns you about. The physical symptoms are fading, you're sleeping a little better, and, well, everything still feels gray. That flatness is harder to sit with than the bad nights were. Today, we are unpacking the clinical realities of why quitting weed makes you feel so depressed. We're going to look at why this flatness is actually the physical process of recovery happening in real time rather than, the final result. And we're going to define the exact window where most people give up because they completely misread the situation they're in.
Yeah, that gray feeling is a physiological reality. It is not a personal failure, and it is definitely not a sign that you are broken. When you remove a substance that has been actively altering your brain chemistry for months or years, the nervous system has to undergo a massive rebalancing act. That process is physical, it is measurable, and it feels incredibly heavy. The brain is literally restructuring itself, and that requires energy that is currently being diverted away from your mood.
We really need to look at the mechanical gears driving this heaviness so you know exactly what is happening in your head. Because people often think weed is just a mild relaxant. But in reality, it is aggressively activating the brain's reward system through the endocannabinoid pathway. And that specific pathway indirectly but powerfully boosts dopamine. Dopamine is not just the chemical of pleasure. It is the chemical that gives you the feeling of motivation. It is the drive to get off the couch and the sense that an activity is going to be rewarding before you even do it.
Right, and daily use changes the fundamental architecture of how the brain operates. When THC is constantly flooding the system and propping up those dopamine levels artificially, the brain becomes highly efficient. It recognizes that it does not need to produce as much dopamine on its own, so the internal production dials down significantly. The actual receptors that catch dopamine also retreat. They become less sensitive to avoid being overwhelmed by the constant flood of chemicals. Your brain essentially begins to rely entirely on that external input just to maintain its daily baseline of feeling okay.
Look, I always look at the brain like a local manufacturing factory that made a terrible decision to outsource its power supply. For years, this factory relied on a massive external power grid, which is the THC. Because that external grid delivered a massive surge of power every single day, well, the factory management decided to save money. They let their own internal local generators get completely rusty and fall into disrepair. Then suddenly you decide to quit, and the connection to the external grid is cut completely. The factory's plunged into total darkness.
That is a very accurate way to frame it. The workers in that factory now have to go down to the basement and start cranking those rusty internal generators by hand. They have to build new parts and repair the wiring. The downtime before the lights come back on fully, that miserable period where you are waiting for the internal power to spin back up, is what we call the gap. You are living in the gap. The external boost is gone and the internal system is running far below capacity while it recalibrates.
So the flat mood, the completely absent motivation, the feeling that nothing is fun anymore, those are not signs of ruined life.
No, not at all. They are the literal symptoms of a dopamine system that is currently underpowered.
People sitting in this gap are terrified, though. They look around at their life, and they are convinced they have permanently broken their brain, or that they have suddenly developed major clinical depression out of nowhere. We need to put a specific medical name to what they are experiencing. It is anhedonia. Anhedonia is defined as a severely reduced capacity for pleasure. You can eat your absolute favorite food, watch a movie you have always loved, or hang out with your favorite people, and the chemical reward simply does not trigger.
Because the biological bridge is temporarily out. The distinction between anhedonia in this specific withdrawal context and clinical depression is vital to understand here. They share many overlapping traits on the surface. You experience the lack of energy, the creeping hopelessness, and the complete inability to find joy in daily tasks. However, anhedonia during withdrawal has a specific known cause. And more importantly, it has a predictable endpoint. It is not a permanent state of being that you will carry forever. It is a rebuilding process that is actively in progress right now.
I actually have to stop you there. Because if someone is pinned to the couch right now, unable to muster the energy to shower or answer a text message from a friend telling them they have anhedonia instead of depression, sounds like medical pedantry. A Greek vocabulary word does not make the couch any softer or the day any easier to get through. It feels completely irrelevant when you are drowning in that grayness.
I get that. I do. But knowing the mechanical reality of your suffering completely changes your survival strategy. Think about it. If you believe you have suddenly developed a permanent depressive disorder, the most logical response is despair. You will start thinking the only way to fix this permanent brokenness is to go back to the substance that worked before. You will relapse because you think it is your only medication.
Oh, I see what you mean. You think you need the weed just to function as a normal human.
Yes. When you understand that anhedonia is a temporary structural recalibration with a predictable endpoint, it becomes a waiting game. You do not have to fix it, you just have to outlast it.
And outlasting it requires knowing the actual timeline. This brings us to the most dangerous part of the entire recovery process, because this flattening effect does not usually hit on day 1. It emerges around week 2, and it hits the absolute hardest between weeks 2 and 4. We need to call this exactly what it is. This is the resilience phase. The narrative that the early days are the hardest stretch is completely false. The physical sweating, the lack of appetite, and the insomnia of the early days are difficult, but the middle stretch is the true test of recovery.
The middle stretch is where the entire psychological battle takes place. In the first week, the physical symptoms provided a clear enemy. You knew you were sweating and shaking because of withdrawal. You could point to it. But by week 3, your sleep has mostly normalized and the night sweats are gone, yet your daily life feels completely devoid of color. This is when the brain starts to play vicious tricks on you. This is the timing trap. Most relapses happen in this specific window because of how the brain interprets the absence of physical symptoms.
People completely misread the grayness. They look at their life in week 3 and think, well, the physical withdrawal is over. I am fully sober now, and this is just what sober life feels like. They assume life without weed is going to be permanently boring and flat forever. I remember a friend going through this exact realization, assuming life was just going to be a permanent gray slog from that point on. They interpret a temporary delayed withdrawal symptom as a permanent reality of sobriety.
But that interpretation is physically incorrect. The brain is still actively repairing those dopamine receptors deep into the 3rd and 4th wicks. The factory workers are still cranking those generators. By weeks 6 to 8, the vast majority of daily users notice a genuine sustained improvement. The internal generators finally shake off the rust and start producing sufficient baseline dopamine again. The lights in the factory come back on.
So they actually do get back to normal.
Better than normal, often. In fact, many people find they are emotionally much more even at week 8 than they ever were during their using years. Cannabis was actually amplifying their mood swings over time, creating a highly volatile baseline. It was not stabilizing their mood, even if it provided a temporary illusion of stability in the short term.
Okay, we are promising a lot of relief by weeks 6 to 8 for most people.
Yeah.
But we have to honestly address the underlying mental health exception here. Because a massive portion of the population did not just start smoking for fun at parties. They started using cannabis because it effectively masked pre-existing anxiety, depression, or severe emotional pain. We really cannot ignore that reality.
No, we cannot. Stopping the use of cannabis strips away that heavy masking agent. It completely exposes whatever was underneath it to begin with. Weed provided short-term relief for that pain, but physiologically, chronic use gradually increases the baseline of anxiety and depression. It makes the underlying condition worse over the long term. When you finally stop, you are hit with a brutal double impact. You are dealing with the withdrawal-induced anhedonia we just discussed, and simultaneously, you are confronting the original emotional pain that has now been amplified by years of chemical alteration.
Severe or persistent symptoms require professional help. If you are unable to get out of bed for days, if you are experiencing any thoughts of self-harm, or if these intense symptoms last well beyond that 6 to 8 week mark, you need to bring in a doctor or a licensed therapist. We are not judging the use of weed for mental health at all. We are simply looking at the physiological outcome. Self-medicating with THC significantly complicates the recovery timeline. Pointing to professional support is the most practical and necessary step you can take.
A therapist or a medical professional can help you decouple the temporary withdrawal symptoms from the underlying psychological condition. You do not have to fight a chemical recalibration and a pre-existing mental health challenge entirely on your own. It is an overwhelming combination for anyone. Utilizing support structures is not a sign of weakness or failure in your recovery. It is a highly logical strategy for navigating a complex physical transition.
So if you are in the resilience phase and you have ruled out a severe underlying crisis that requires a doctor, how do you actually get through these weeks? You know what is happening, you know it is temporary, and you know the timeline. Now we need to look at the actionable levers you can pull to survive this specific window. And the single biggest lever you can pull right now is daily exercise. We're specifically talking about cardiovascular exercise. Cardio boosts dopamine and endorphin production through biological mechanisms that are completely independent of THC.
The massive problem here, though, is that anhedonia destroys your motivation to move. People sit on the couch and wait until they feel motivated to go for a run or to drive to the gym. In this phase, the motivation will never arrive. The chemical required to generate that feeling of anticipation is currently depleted. You have to understand that action must precede motivation. You have to put your shoes on and start moving first.
Because the physical movement forces the central nervous system to release endorphins.
Exactly. The motivation, or at least a mild sense of accomplishment, only follows the physical action. You cannot wait for it.
Sunlight and a daily walk act as a powerful secondary lever. Getting outside combines physical movement, natural light exposure, and sensory changes in your environment. When natural sunlight hits your retinas, particularly in the morning, it regulates your circadian rhythm and directly influences serotonin production. It breaks up the physical stagnation in your living room that makes the gray feeling so unbearable. It shifts the brain out of a dormant state.
And low-key social contact is another crucial element that you have to actively manage. Isolation feeds the flat mood and gives your brain too much time to dwell on the anhedonia. You do not need to attend a massive party or be the center of attention in a crowded room. A short walk with a friend, buying a coffee and chatting with the barista, or just a brief 10-minute phone call is enough. The goal is simply to disrupt the isolation and force your brain to engage a different cognitive pathway.
Now, the final piece of advice experts give for this phase is to stop trying to feel good. I have to say, I find this highly skeptical and really hard to swallow. It sounds completely counterintuitive to everything we hear about recovery, self-help, or getting better. Telling someone who's completely miserable in week 3 to stop trying to feel good just sounds like telling them to give up and wallow in their own misery.
I know it sounds negative, but actively forcing positive feelings during a state of anhedonia always backfires. If you try your hardest to feel joy by forcing yourself to do something you used to love, like playing a specific video game or listening to your favorite album, and your brain fails to produce that joy, the disappointment is absolutely crushing. You take that failure as concrete evidence that you are permanently broken.
Oh, wow. So trying to be happy actually makes you feel worse if it does not work.
Yes. Acceptance stops that specific downward spiral. You acknowledge that the current phase is flat, you complete your basic daily tasks like eating and showering, and you intentionally remove the pressure to feel happy while you do them.
You essentially treat it like a bad cold.
Yeah.
I mean, you do not try to force yourself to feel healthy and vibrant when you have the flu. You drink water, you rest on the couch, and you wait for the immune system to do its job. Acceptance keeps you moving forward through the days without adding massive layers of guilt and frustration on top of an already difficult chemical deficit. You give the factory time to repair the generators without yelling at the workers.
That is a perfect way to look at it. And the human brain has incredible redundant systems built into it, which offers a fascinating perspective on this entire recovery process. The social reward pathway we discussed earlier operates on a completely different biological system than the THC-depleted dopamine pathway. It relies heavily on oxytocin and serotonin. This means that even when your primary pleasure centers are totally offline and recalibrating in the dark, your brain has a built-in backup generator for finding meaning. You can still access a sense of connection and grounding through simple, quiet interactions with other human beings.
If you want a map for getting through this stretch, take the free self-check at quit-smoking-weed.com.